The rain in Sector 4 never just fell, it decayed. It was a chemical, heavy downpour that slicked the cracked asphalt beneath Kael's worn boots, carrying the bitter stench of rust and low-grade fuel from the upper-tier foundries. Kael was 23, but his hands, calloused and stained with industrial grease, belonged to a man twice his age. For the past 3 years, his life had been reduced to a brutal, unyielding sequence of double shifts, cold synthetic broth, and the unforgiving mathematics of survival. Every single credit he earned was immediately swallowed by the sterile, neon-lit bureaucracy of the Eldritch Medical Corporation. Inside Ward 9, breathing through a rhythmic, wheezing mechanical respirator, was Lyra. She was 22, his wife, and her lungs were slowly turning to stone from glass lung syndrome, a disease contracted from working the silicon vats in the lower levels. The cost to keep her heart beating was exactly 80,000 credits a week. It was a mountain of debt Kael could never climb, no matter how many hours he sold to the factories. Then came the night the grid failed. Kael was walking back from a 16-hour shift at the logistics depot, his muscles aching with a deep, systemic fatigue. Behind the neon glare of a cheap synthetic diner, tucked between two overflowing waste compactors, he saw a shape. It was an old man, shivering violently, wrapped in a threadbare coat that offered no protection against the freezing rain. In his frail, trembling hands, he held nothing but a broken copper umbrella. To anyone else in Sector 4, the old man was invisible, just another piece of human debris discarded by the city's relentless machinery. But Kael stopped. He remembered Lyra's cold hands. He knew what it felt like to be ignored by a world that only valued profit. "Hey," Kael muttered gently, kneeling into the wet grime. He didn't have much, just a small thermal container of warm vegetable broth he'd saved from his shift in a dry, sheltered corner beneath the overhanging porch of his cramped apartment a few blocks away. "It's not much, but it's warm. Come on." The old man didn't speak. He just looked up with pale, milky eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. He accepted the broth, his fingers brushing against Kael's with a surprising, static warmth. Kael helped him back to his porch, wrapped him in his only spare blanket, and sat with him in silence until the shivering stopped. He didn't ask for a name. In the lower tiers, names didn't matter. Kindness was the only currency that held any real value. The next morning, the old man was gone. Left on the wooden crate where he had slept was a small, rusted iron key. It had no tags, no markings, just an archaic design that felt entirely out of place in a world built on digital code. Kael pocketed it, thinking it a meaningless token of gratitude, and went back to the factories. He had no idea that the old man was Alden, the reclusive high elder of the Illyria Wealth Trust, a man who commanded a staggering fortune of 21 billion credits across multiple planetary sectors. 3 days later, the sky above Sector 4 tore open. A sleek, obsidian-black atmospheric transport, bearing the golden sigil of the Illyrian High Court, descended directly into the slums. The crowd of tier workers scattered like dust as two heavily armored enforcers stepped out, their faces hidden behind polished glass visors. They didn't ask questions. They simply flanked Kael, escorted him into the luxurious leather interior of the transport, and rocketed upward, leaving the smog-choked slums behind. They brought him to the apex of the city, a towering glass and steel monolith that pierced the clouds, where the air was artificially pure and the floors were made of polished white marble. Kael stood there in his grease-stained overalls, a stark, uncomfortable blemish in a room filled with people who looked at him not as a human being, but as dirt on their hand-stitched silk shoes. At the center of the chamber stood Vane. He was 35, dressed in a sharp, immaculate charcoal tunic, his eyes cold and calculating like a predatory ledger. Beside him was Cynthia, 26, Alden's biological niece. Her posture was dripping with aristocratic disdain, her gaze raking over Kael with unvarnished disgust. To them, Kael was an insect that had crawled out of the vents. "Let's not waste time," Cynthia sneered, her voice cutting through the soft ambient hum of the room's climate control. "He smells of the lower vats. Read the directive, Vane, so we can throw this garbage back to where it belongs." Vane didn't smile, but his fingers tapped against a glowing data slate with a terrifying, patient rhythm. "Kael of Sector 4, Vane announced, his voice smooth as oil. "The High Elder Alden has passed." Before his departure, he amended his final trust directive. "Because of an act of unprompted preservation you performed on the night of the grid failure, you have been brought into the Illyria Gauntlet. Vane tapped the screen, and a massive, holographic projection materialized in the center of the glass room. A digital counter, glowing in brilliant gold, displayed a number that made Kael's breath catch in his throat: 1 billion credits. 1 billion credits, Vane continued, his eyes narrowing. Transferred immediately into a temporary spatial ring tied to your biometric signature. But it is not a gift, boy. It is a gauntlet. You have exactly 7 days, 168 hours, to spend every single credit. But there are conditions. The hologram shifted, revealing a dense web of ancient legal script. First, every single cent must be utilized directly for the preservation, rehabilitation, or structural benefit of human life. Second, if a single credit is spent on yourself, your personal desires, or to directly enrich your immediate family, the contract is broken. Third, if the clock hits 0 and even 1 copper coin remains unspent, the entirety of the fund reverts instantly to the Illyria Private Executive Trust, managed by myself and Lady Cynthia. Kael's mind was racing, the sheer scale of the numbers threatening to crush him. 1 billion credits could rebuild entire sectors. It could save millions. But then, a cold realization struck him. My wife, Kael said, his voice raw. Lyra. She's dying in Ward 9. I need 80,000 credits to clear her debt and guarantee her medical treatment. If I use this fund to pay her bill, does it violate the self-enrichment clause? Cynthia let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Vane merely allowed a cruel, tight smile to cross his features. Paying the debt of a spouse is a direct relief of personal liability, Vane whispered, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. The moment you sign a transfer to her account, the system flags it as a family enrichment violation. The ring shatters. The fortune returns to us. And your wife, well, I believe the Eldridge Corporation is very strict about non-payment. Kael felt the walls closing in. The game wasn't just difficult, it was a psychological execution. He looked down at his trembling hands, then reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, rusted iron key Alden had left him. There was another person in the room, Iris, a 27-year-old pro bono advocate appointed by the neutral High Court to ensure the text of the will wasn't altered. She stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the data slate, giving Kael a quiet, barely perceptible nod. The terms were ironclad, but they were real. I take the terms, Kael said, his voice hardening. He looked directly into Vane's cold eyes. Give me the ring. Cynthia hissed in frustration, but Vane smoothly handed over the glowing silver band. The moment Kael slid it onto his finger, a soft chime echoed through the room. The master clock appeared in his vision, a brilliant, terrifying countdown glowing in digital crimson, 168:00:00. Kael didn't wait for their dismissals. He turned on his heel and walked out of the glass tower, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't care about the billions, the luxury, or the prestige. He had to think like a logistics coordinator. He had to find the cracks in their system. He needed to save his wife, and he had to do it without touching a single coin for her directly. He took the high-speed lift down to the transit hub, heading straight for a public data terminal. His fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, typing in the routing codes for the Eldridge Medical Corporation. He couldn't pay Lyra's bill directly, but he could pay the hospital's general operational debt. If he donated 5 million credits to the hospital's charity wing, surely they would clear her account as a gesture of goodwill? It was a logical loophole. He hit the execution key. The screen didn't turn green. Instead, a massive, flashing crimson block cut through the interface, reflecting off Kael's pale face. A harsh systemic warning tone echoed from the terminal. Account frequently frozen. Under internal regulatory compliance hold. Kael stared at the screen, his blood running cold. From the shadows of the transit hub, a sleek corporate drone hovered into view, its optical sensors pulsing with a steady, mocking red light. A audio projection spilled from its speakers, carrying Vane's smooth, detached voice. Did you truly think it would be that simple, Kael? A boy from the slums, moving millions through standard commercial channels? The Illyria Executive Trust has standard oversight on all high-tier medical banking.
We have flagged your account for a standard 96-hour compliance review to verify the origin of the funds. 96 hours. The realization hit Kael like a physical blow. Lyra's medical window, the time remaining before the Eldridge Corporation would legally disconnect her respirator due to delinquency, was exactly 99 hours. Vane hadn't just blocked the transfer. He had locked the doors to the arena before Kael could even take his first step. The digital bank transfer was a promise, a line of code that Vane could choke with paperwork and regulatory delays until the clock ran out. The red light of the terminal blinked rhythmically, a digital executioner counting down the seconds. Kael stood alone in the rain of Sector 4, holding a $1 billion ring he couldn't use, while his wife's life slipped away on a hospital bed he couldn't pay for. The gauntlet had begun, and he was already losing. The red warning light on the public data terminal didn't just signify a rejected transaction, it was a psychological wall meant to starve Kael of his resolve. With 96 hours of compliance delays hanging over his head like a digital guillotine, and only 99 hours left on Lyra's medical window, Kael knew he couldn't play by the rules of the high-tier financial institutions. A bank transfer was merely a digital promise, easily strangled by Vane's endless corporate red tape. If he wanted to move 1 billion credits, he had to stop thinking about abstract data and start focusing on the physical world. He needed assets that moved on a different track, assets that Vane's commercial banking freeze couldn't legally touch. To achieve this, Kael needed an engineer who understood the raw, structural underbelly of the city. He needed Gideon. Gideon was 28, possessing a massive, heavy-set frame that bore the unmistakable marks of a master blacksmith. His knuckles were permanently scarred by heat, and his thick beard constantly smelled of soot and cheap, low-grade sugarcane liquor. Once, Gideon had been the lead visionary for Illyria's underground municipal infrastructure, the brilliant mind tasked with designing the massive hydroducts that channeled fresh mountain springs into the city. But he was a man of unbending integrity. When the Eldritch-backed council demanded he divert the natural waterways away from the residential slums and into the private estates of the nobility, Gideon refused. He was instantly stripped of his titles, blacklisted from every professional guild, and driven into an embittered exile at the very edge of the outer desert. Kael found him in a cramped, smoky smithy tucked inside a cavernous junkyard, half buried under rusted gears and discarded iron plating. Gideon was staring into a low, dying forge, nursing a clay mug of bitter alcohol. "The commercial accounts are locked, Gideon," Kael said without preamble, stepping into the warmth of the forge as the freezing rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof. "Vane wants to freeze me out by delaying the digital ledger. I need to move 5 million gold credits into physical infrastructure, and I need to do it before sunrise." Gideon didn't look up, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Go back to your glass towers, kid. The water in this city belongs to the corporate lords now. They call it the pure sovereign stream, but it's just rain captured from our sky and sold back to our children at the price of a silver coin a gallon. It's a rigged game." "Then let's break the board," Kael replied, leaning over the grease-stained anvil. "The old subterranean pumping vault, Sector 9. The one scheduled for demolition in less than 48 hours to clear land for Cynthia's private summer conservatory. If that station is leveled, 30,000 families in the outer ring lose their secondary municipal supply forever, forcing them onto Vane's private high-tariff water lines. Am I right?" Gideon's hand tightened around his clay mug until the pottery groaned. "That vault is an ancient marvel. It was built during the founding era, tapping directly into the deep mountain aquifers. It's not dead, just neglected. But you can't buy it. Vane has a legal block on every commercial asset purchase under your name." "He blocks commercial accounts," Kael said, a sharp, determined light entering his eyes. "But he forgot the ancient legal codex of Illyria. Section 12, any resident may directly absorb municipal public debt to clear a stagnant territory. The outer desert landfill and the attached pumping vault are currently listed as public liabilities due to municipal back taxes. It's not a commercial purchase. It's a direct debt acquisition from the city registry." Gideon slowly set his mug down, a spark of awakening intelligence cutting through his alcohol-induced haze. "The registry is completely automated. If you clear the city's outstanding public debt directly through the sovereign municipal terminal, the deed is generated instantly by the crown,
bypassing the Executive Trust's commercial veto entirely. Without wasting another second, Kael stepped to the forge's mechanical console and synchronized his silver spatial ring with the archaic registry port. 5 million gold credits evaporated from the counter in his vision, the master clock adjusting with a soft chime to 164:12:05. In return, a physical, heavy parchment rolled out of the terminal, stamped with the ancient crimson seal of Illyria's founding council. The landfill and the ancient trilateral pumping vault legally belonged to Kael. But owning the deed was only the beginning of the nightmare. When Kael and Gideon arrived at the deep valley edge where the pumping vault sat, the scale of the crisis became starkly apparent. The facility was a decaying concrete tomb. The lower levels were completely flooded with 6 feet of stagnant, pitch-black water that had overflowed from the surrounding industrial runoff drains, completely submerging the primary electrical breakers. If they couldn't drain the facility and engage the master turbines within 12 hours, the city's automated demolition drones would arrive, identify the structure as an abandoned biohazard, and tear it down regardless of the deed. Worse, as they descended the crumbling iron stairs, a high-pitched, harmonic chime echoed from the upper observation deck. A contingent of Vane's elite enforcement mages materialized in the doorway, their pristine white robes glowing with protective wards. They held a glowing violet scroll, a preemptive administrative injunction. "This facility is locked by order of the Executive Trust," the lead mage announced, his voice echoing coldly off the damp stone walls. "We have received anonymous alerts regarding potential toxic contagion within these waters. You are ordered to cease all operations immediately pending a 12-day safety evaluation." 12 days? Gideon roared, raising a massive iron wrench. "The demolition drones will turn this place to gravel by tomorrow morning." "The injunction only covers standard corporate operations," Kael countered, stepping forward and thrusting the heavy, crimson-stamped debt parchment directly into the mage's glowing ward. "Under the Sovereign Enclave Act, a public debt retriever has 12 hours of absolute jurisdictional immunity to stabilize a hazardous public asset. If you try to enforce an executive seal inside these gates before dawn, you are committing an act of treason against the Crown Registry." The 12 iron wagons, driven by the forgotten, bankrupt haulers of the agricultural belt, didn't approach the main gate where Vane's mages stood. Guided by Kael's logistics map, they swerved directly into the residential blocks, opening their massive, newly retrofitted secondary valves directly into the public squares. Clean, clear, mineral-rich mountain water drawn from the vault's deeper, unpolluted pristine aquifers that Gideon had just unlocked gushed out in a torrential, life-saving cascade. The protest dissolved into a scramble of pure, ecstatic relief. Hundreds of people rushed forward with buckets, thermals, and clay jars, their anger vanishing the moment the sweet, cool water touched their lips. The media wagons tried to pivot their cameras to maintain the narrative of corruption, but the image of thousands of laughing, relieved citizens filling their jars from the iron wagons was a reality that no corporate spin could destroy. Cynthia watched from her floating carriage, her face turning a deep, furious crimson as she realized her broadcast had just provided Kael with a citywide stage for his first massive victory. She slammed her hand against the carriage console, ordering the drivers to retreat into the clouds. Gideon stepped up onto the balcony beside Kael, looking down at the thriving, water-filled streets below, then back into the darkened depths of the vault where the ancient iron safe still waited for its key. "We won the first round, kid," Gideon said, a genuine, booming laugh shaking his chest. 30,000 people have water, and Vane's court order is nothing but wet paper. But look at your screen. The clock doesn't care about our celebrations." Kael looked down at his silver ring. The digital countdown was ticking relentlessly forward, the numbers glowing in the cool dawn air, 152:45:12. He had spent 6 million credits, but the weight in his chest was only growing heavier. He could feel the systemic cold of the city creeping into his lungs, and he knew that across the tiers, Vane was already preparing a much darker, much more personal trap. The lead mage's eyes widened as his scanning spell verified the ancient seal. The document was ironclad. The mages stepped back, their violet barriers flickering out, but their expressions remained deeply malicious. "You have until the first light of dawn, slum dweller," the leader hissed. "But look at this swamp. You don't have the heavy engineering squads or the purification crystals to clear 6 feet of toxic rot in 12 hours. You will drown in your own ambition. They withdrew to the upper perimeter, establishing a watchful blockade. Kael and Gideon were entirely on their own, trapped in a dark, suffocating basement filled with black water that smelled heavily of sulfur and old machine oil.
The mathematics of hydrodynamics are simple when your life depends on them. For 3 excruciating hours, Kael and Gideon worked in near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange flicker of a portable essence lantern.
They didn't have a team of guild engineers, but they had Gideon's heavy-duty steam tractor parked outside and 2 industrial bypass pumps they had purchased with cash from the junk market on their way. Kael's muscles burned as he hauled the heavy copper suction hoses into the stagnant flood, his skin stinging from the mild magical irritants laced within the runoff. "Keep tightening the pressure valves," Gideon yelled, his voice echoing through the chamber as he manually cranked the steam tractor's external power takeoff. The ancient pump sputtered, caught, and began to roar with a deafening, metallic rhythm. The black water slowly, agonizingly, began to recede. As the water level dropped to the floorboards, revealing the furthest, most ancient corner of the foundation, the beam of Kael's lantern caught something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a standard water line or an electrical breaker. Embedded directly into the primordial granite of the mountain wall was a massive, heavy iron safe, bolted with reinforced titanium rivets. It was older than the city itself, its surface etched with intricate, non-commercial geometric patterns. And right in the center of the heavy locking dial was a small, circular indentation. Kael's heart skipped a beat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusted iron key that Alden had left on his porch. The shape was an exact, flawless match. Before Kael could even step toward the safe, the sound of amplified, metallic voices boomed down from the upper streets. Cynthia had arrived, and she had brought the media wagons. Outside, the perimeter was lined with 3 massive, floating broadcast carriages, their crystal projectors casting brilliant, 30-foot-tall holographic displays into the night sky for the entire city to see. Cynthia stood before the lenses, her emerald-green silk dress shimmering under the artificial spotlights, her face twisted into an expression of theatrical sorrow. "Look upon the greed of this slum-born usurper," her voice echoed through the eastern wards, amplified by audio arrays. "Kael of Sector 4 has purchased our historical water vault not to save it, but to hoard it. He has introduced illegal alchemical compounds into the reservoir, spoiling the water supply of 30,000 families so he can claim a massive tax write-off from the High Court. He is starving your children of pure water to line his own pockets." Inside the gates, the local tier workers, already exhausted, thirsty, and deeply terrified of losing their water, began to gather. A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd outside the fence. They didn't understand the legal technicalities, they only knew their taps were dry, and Cynthia's holographic screens were showing Kael standing in a pool of black filth. A rock shattered against the vault's upper glass windows. The crowd was turning into a weapon. "They're going to tear the gates down," Kael, Gideon muttered, wiping black grease from his brow as he looked out the narrow high-aperture slit. "If they riot, Vane's mages have the legal right to execute an emergency martial sweep. They'll kill the project and bury us under the pretense of restoring public order." Kael didn't panic. He looked at the receding water, then at the physical manifests of his debt acquisition. "Gideon, how many independent water haulers are there in the outer agricultural belt? The men who own the old, unregistered iron wagons?" "At least 12 major family syndicates," Gideon replied, his eyes narrowing in thought. "But they're broke. Vane's commercial monopoly barred them from accessing the primary spring heads 3 months ago. They're sitting on empty tanks, facing bankruptcy." "They aren't empty anymore," Kael said, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Iris." He turned to the young advocate who had just arrived with the physical registration receipts. "Draft 12 independent logistics contracts immediately. We aren't paying a commercial guild. We are employing local, independent transport providers for emergency municipal distribution. 1 million credits, paid in physical gold coin from the registry's liquid reserve, to be divided among the 12 drivers upon immediate delivery." Iris's fingers flew across her slate, her eyes shining with realization. "The commercial block cannot touch independent emergency contracts funded by a municipal debt holder. It's completely outside Vane's jurisdiction." Kael ran up the stairs and threw open the heavy vault doors, stepping directly out onto the iron balcony overlooking the angry crowd. The spotlights from the media wagons pivoted instantly, blinding him, while the crowd jeered.
"Listen to me."
Kael's voice cut through the damp air, steady, unyielding, and completely devoid of fear. "The pipes to your homes are empty because Vane's injunction has locked the valves, not because we lack water.
If you want pure water, look behind you." In the distance, a deep, rhythmic mechanical rumble began to vibrate through the earth. It wasn't the sound of corporate transport gliders. It was the heavy, iron-shod thunder of 12 massive, dented, industrial steam wagons, their chimneys billowing thick white smoke as they tore through the outer ring's muddy roads. The sweet taste of victory at the water plant was quickly replaced by the bitter reality of the master clock. As the morning sun broke through the heavy smog of Illyria, casting long, golden beams across the wet concrete of the outer ring, Kael's silver ring chimed. The crimson numbers in his vision read 144:18:22. He had spent 6 million credits, but the remaining balance was a staggering, suffocating mountain of wealth that he had to move. Yet, the physical fatigue of working through the night was nothing compared to the sudden, icy dread that seized his heart when Iris burst into the command trailer, her face completely pale. Iris was 27, a brilliant, unbending pro bono advocate from the High Court who had chosen to stand by Kael when the rest of the legal system looked at him with disdain. She wore the simple, unadorned robes of a public defender, but her sharp, observant eyes carried the fierce intelligence of someone who knew exactly how the elite used the law as a weapon. She didn't look at Kael with her usual calm, professional composure. Instead, she tightly held a piece of parchment that bore the dark, metallic wax seal of the Eldritch Medical Corporation. Vane found the Crossworld Gateway Ledger, Kael, Iris said, her voice dropping to a tense, urgent whisper. He discovered where Lyra is being held on Trade-at. He didn't just lock the accounts here, he has initiated an extraordinary asset seizure on your home world. The Eldritch Corporation has purchased the outstanding medical debt of the VIP ward where Lyra is breathing. They are preparing to cut the power to her life support matrix by midnight. Kael felt the room tilt. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden blueprint table so hard his knuckles turned white. He wants me to transfer the funds to her hospital directly, Kael muttered, his mind instantly racing through the logistics. He's waiting for me to hit the button. Yes, Iris pleaded, grabbing his arm. It's an absolute trap. The self-enrichment clause in Alden's will states that any direct or indirect financial relief granted to an immediate family member will trigger an immediate, automated reversion of the entire inheritance. The second you spend even 80,000 credits to clear her personal bill, the ring will shatter, the 1 billion will return to Vane's private trust, and they will still cut her power. He has turned your love for your wife into a weapon to destroy you. Before Kael could respond, a low, resonant hum vibrated from the center of the room. A black communications mirror, provided by the Court for Administrative Oversight, flickered to life. The polished glass surface dissolved into a live, real-time projection from Trade-at. Kael gasped, stepping toward the mirror. On the screen was the pristine, sterile white interior of the high-tier VIP ward at the Eldritch Medical Center. Lyra lay on the hovering bed, her pale, delicate face framed by a complex web of glowing energy tubes that rhythmically pumped vital essence into her failing lungs. But she wasn't resting. Two corporate enforcers in heavy gray uniforms were systematically dismantling the decorative thermal curtains, while an automated drone hovered over her bed, flashing a cold, yellow eviction notice. Through the Crossworld audio link, Kael could hear her weeping. The sound was frail, terrified, and cut through the quiet Illyrian morning like a jagged shard of ice. Kael? Lyra's voice trembled through the glass, her fingers clutching the thin white sheets of her bed. There are men here, they say you abandoned the family debt. They say they're moving me to the lower tiers. Kael, please, it's so cold here. I can't breathe without the core matrix. Kael pressed his hand against the cold glass of the mirror, his tears finally breaking through his stoic composure. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to authorize the transfer, to throw the millions at the hospital to make them leave her alone. But Vane's face suddenly flickered into the corner of the mirror, his elegant charcoal tunic immaculate, a recording device humming in his hand. He didn't say a word, he just raised an eyebrow, waiting for Kael to speak the words of authorization that would seal his failure.
Kael had to make a choice that tore his soul in half. He couldn't explain the rules of the gauntlet to her. Vane's recording would use any explanation of a workaround as proof of collusion to bypass the contract. He had to act completely devoid of emotion, like a cold, calculating logistics coordinator, even while his heart was shattering into dust. Iris, Kael said, his voice dropping into a flat, unnerving whisper, though his eyes were wild with agony. Contact our legal representative on Trade-at, instruct them to immediately and voluntarily withdraw Lyra from the Eldritch VIP facility. Lyra let out a sharp, heartbroken cry through the audio link. Kael, no. Please. Move her, Kael continued, forcing the words out of his throat while his chest burned with suffocating pain. Transfer her to the Sector 4 public charity clinic. The understaffed one near the old silicon vats. The one that doesn't charge an initial admission fee because it uses outdated, manual respiratory pumps. Kael, that place is a ruin. Lyra sobbed, her image fading as the corporate enforcers began to wheel her bed toward the service lift. Why are you doing this to me? The mirror went completely dark, leaving Kael standing in the silent Illyrian trailer, his reflection showing a man completely hollowed out by grief. Vane's trap had succeeded in causing absolute misery, but by legally removing Lyra from the private hospital's registry and placing her into a state-run, non-profit charity clinic, her personal debt was effectively frozen. She was no longer a customer of the Eldritch Corporation. The conflict of interest trap had been violently disarmed, but the cost was that his wife was now breathing through an unreliable, manual pump in the worst slum on Trade-at. They think I'm a monster, Kael whispered, staring at his hands. Iris stepped beside him, her expression shifting from terror to a quiet, profound realization. No, Kael. You just took away his leverage. Now, Vane has no hostage left to protect his empire. Look at the data slate. It's time to strike back. Kael wiped his face, the sorrow in his eyes hardening into an absolute, unyielding rage. He didn't look at the small numbers anymore. He looked at the entire macroeconomy of Illyria's healthcare infrastructure. Iris, how do the high-tier hospitals in this city maintain their monopoly on life? Kael asked, his fingers flying across the registry terminal. Through the recovery crystals, Iris explained, her legal mind instantly adapting to his strategy. Every single medical facility in Illyria relies on these mana-infused crystals to power their healing wards and respiratory systems. But the patent for the forging process of these crystals is entirely owned by 3 major Magus guilds, which are secretly funded by Vane's private executive trust. They inflate the prices by 500%, forcing the hospitals into debt, which forces the citizens into poverty. Then we don't buy the crystals, Kael said, a fierce, brilliant smile breaking through his exhaustion. We buy the forge. Using the biometric silver ring, Kael initiated a series of rapid, sweeping acquisitions through the High Court's automated industrial registry. The 3 major Magus guilds were highly profitable, but like all corporate entities in Illyria, their underlying patents were tied to physical real estate, the grand alchemical foundries located in the industrial hearth sector. The guilds had recently taken massive loans from the city to expand their production lines, creating a legal vulnerability. Kael didn't negotiate. He targeted the primary debt liabilities of the foundries, using the same public debt absorption coho that had secured the water plant. In a sequence of 3 massive, successive transactions that shook the Illyrian financial markets to their core, Kael transferred 150 million gold credits directly into the High Court's master treasury. The counter on his ring rapidly spun down, settling at a new balance, while the master clock chimed softly, 142:02:10. In less than 10 minutes, Kael had become the sole, absolute owner of the manufacturing patents and the physical foundries that produced every single recovery crystal in the planetary sector. He didn't use his new monopoly to raise prices or enrich himself. Instead, within an hour of the acquisition, Iris delivered a newly drafted, ironclad master lease agreement to every single hospital and clinic across Illyria, including the private facilities owned by Vane's associates. The terms of Kael's lease were beautifully, devastatingly simple. The foundries would provide an endless, unlimited supply of recovery crystals to every medical facility for exactly 1 copper coin a year.
But the lease came with a single, non-negotiable, sovereign condition. Any hospital that accepted these free crystals must immediately, permanently, and completely forgive the outstanding debts of every single patient currently registered on their books.
Furthermore, they were legally barred from ever charging a citizen for basic respiratory or life support services again. If a hospital refused Kael's terms, they would have to buy crystals from the open market, but there was no open market left, because Kael owned the patents. Refusal meant immediate operational bankruptcy. Acceptance meant the total, instant liberation of thousands of medical debtors. By doing this, Kael didn't spend a single credit to pay Lyra's bill.
He didn't provide a direct financial benefit to his family.
Instead, he had restructured the entire economic fabric of the city's healthcare system. The private hospital on Tredat, which operated under the same overarching eldritch corporate parent, was legally forced to sign the master lease to save its own planetary network. The automated system inside Kael's silver ring hummed smoothly, its internal sensors identifying the transaction as a massive, valid act of systemic humanitarian rehabilitation. The self-enrichment clause remained completely untouched. In his luxury penthouse high above the clouds, Vane stood before his central terminal, watching the holographic stock tickers of his medical guilds plunge into absolute zero. The gold pen in his hand snapped cleanly in half, staining his white marble desk with dark, expensive ink. He looked at the screen, then at the image of Kael standing in the muddy streets of the outer ring, surrounded by a growing group of local Waita and common workers who were realizing that their debts had just vanished into thin air. The trap had supped due, but as Kael walked back into the crisp, cold air of the lower tiers, he knew the war was far from over. His wife was still in a rundown clinic, breathing through an old manual pump, and Vane was a man who would rather burn the entire city to ash than allow a slum-born kid to dictate the terms of his surrender. 4. The biofuel inferno and the sovereign dock. The corporate retaliation was swift, calculated, and completely devoid of mercy. Within hours of Kael's victory over the medical monopolies, Vane struck back not through the courts, but through the highest legislative body in Illyria, the House of Senate Clans. Citing a manufactured state of emergency regarding unregulated economic disruption, Vane successfully pushed through a federal embargo decree, instantly freezing another 440 million gold credits within Kael's digital ledger.
The crimson countdown in Kael's vision suddenly flickered, the time brutally shaved down by regulatory penalization.
He had exactly 48 hours left on the master clock, millions of credits locked behind a political wall, and a city on the brink of a devastating winter food shortage. To break this blockade, Kael had to move entirely away from the city's modern infrastructure. He returned to the ancient pumping vault he had purchased on day 2. Diving deep into the sub-basement with Gideon's heavy diving gear, Kael waded through the final remnants of the cleared water lines until he reached the heavy iron safe embedded in the granite foundation. He inserted Alden's rusted iron key into the ancient dial. With a heavy, metallic thud that echoed through the flooded stone chamber, the sealed door creaked open. Inside, protected by layers of waterproof oilskin, lay a document older than the Senate itself, the 200-year-old original charter of the Misty Harbor, designated under ancient crown law as a sovereign dock. According to this historical decree, the harbor was a legally independent enclave, completely immune to any modern federal embargoes or Senate mandates. But a sovereign port meant nothing without the people who ran it. At the harbor gates stood Silas. Silas was 45, a towering, weather-worn figure with skin like tan leather and eyes that held the cold, unyielding gray of the sea. As the leader of the Misty Harbor Dockworkers Union, he was a fiercely protective man who had spent his entire life watching corrupt noble families exploit the labor of his people. He didn't care about billionaire wills, and he certainly didn't trust a kid from the suburbs wearing a glowing silver ring. "I've seen your kind before, Kael," Silas rumbled, spitting into the dark waters of the slipway as Kael presented the ancient charter. "You buy a piece of paper from the archive, and you think you own the backs of 20,000 men. We don't move cargo for corporate ghosts. And right now, we can't move anything anyway. Vane has banned the ether oil guilds from selling maritime fuel to this harbor. The cranes are dead, and the winter grain transport ships are stranded 10 miles out in the frozen channel." "I don't want to buy Vane's fuel, Silas," Kael said, stepping forward so he was eye to eye with the massive union leader. "And I don't want to own your men. I want to buy your freedom. Vane's embargo only blocks standard commercial energy imports.
It doesn't cover agricultural waste. Kael's logistics mind had already identified a massive structural bottleneck in the outer provinces. Due to Vane's strict market price fixing, local farmers were being forced to let millions of tons of surplus organic crops rot in the dirt because they couldn't afford the high transport tariffs. Using his sovereign immunity at the dock, Kael executed a massive, direct purchase order. He bypassed the banking cartels completely, utilizing a cash-clearing clause within the ancient charter to distribute 50 million gold credits directly to the struggling farmers of the outer desert. In less than 12 hours, hundreds of old, independent steam trucks arrived at the harbor, carrying mountains of discarded, fermenting organic crops. "We're going to make our own fuel," Kael told a stunned Silas. Gideon immediately went to work, transforming the harbor's central refinery tanks into a massive, makeshift distillation system. Using Kael's precise formulas for biochemical logistics, they cross-engineered the organic starches, refining them into a high-density, clean-burning alternative fluid of magic biodiesel. It was a brilliant, entirely legal bypass. The harbor's ancient, heavy iron cargo cranes rumbled back to life, their smoke chimneys puffing thick, sweet-smelling white vapor into the gray winter sky. The system inside Kael's silver ring hummed in approval, acknowledging the massive, valid investment in regional agricultural rehabilitation. The master clock adjusted to 36 hours 14 minutes and 2 seconds. The first winter grain ships began to steer into the sovereign docks, their hulls filled with life-saving provisions for 30,000 families. But Cynthia's humiliation had curdled into pure, destructive malice. Realizing that the legal and economic blockades had failed to stop Kael, she decided to rip up the rulebook entirely. She contacted the Wolffangs, a violent, mercenary street gang loyal to her family's private trust. On the 4th hour of the midnight shift, an unnatural silence fell over the secondary storage sector. The security lanterns along the perimeter suddenly flickered and died. Before Kael or Silas could raise an alarm, a series of crude, alchemical firebombs shattered against the reinforced iron walls of the central biodiesel reservoir. The night exploded. A blinding, roaring wall of orange flame erupted into the sky, tearing through the wooden scaffolding and turning the harbor into a blazing furnace. The alternative fuel, while clean, was highly volatile in its unpressurized state. The heat was a physical blow, pushing the screaming dockworkers back as the thick, oily smoke choked the harbor air. If the fire reached the secondary distribution lines connected to the arriving transport ships, the entire sovereign dock would blow up in a catastrophic chain explosion, destroying the food supply and ending the gauntlet in a single breath. "The primary pressure valve is jammed." Gideon's voice bellowed over the roar of the inferno. He had rushed into the pump house beneath the main reservoir, his massive wrench gripping the iron wheel as the overhead pipes began to glow a terrifying, dull red. "The back pressure is building. If I don't vent this line in 3 minutes, the whole sector goes under." "Gideon, get out of there!" Kael screamed, running toward the burning structure. But the smoke was too dense, a heavy black curtain that cut off the exit. Gideon was trapped inside the central control chamber, surrounded by a ring of advancing fire. Kael didn't hesitate. His mind instantly mapped the harbor's ancient structural architecture, calculating the exact flow rates of the nearby water ducts. He grabbed a heavy canvas fire hose, soaking himself in cool harbor water, and plunged directly into the thick, suffocating heat of the inferno. The flames licked at his clothes, the intense heat scorching his skin, but his calculations kept his footing steady. He knew the structural weak points of the building. "Silas, turn the emergency harbor sluice gates to 70% capacity." Kael roared into his shortwave radio, his voice cracking from the smoke. "Divert the main water flow directly into the structural cooling channels beneath the reservoir. It will drop the ambient temperature by 40 degrees. Inside the burning pump house, Kael found Gideon kneeling by the massive iron wheel, his hands blistered from the scorching metal, coughing violently. Kael threw his wet weight against the wrench alongside Gideon. Together, utilizing their combined strength, they forced the corroded iron gears to turn. With a deafening, metallic screech, the valve opened. The high-pressure biodiesel vented safely into the underground emergency concrete holding tanks, away from the active fire. Silas and 100 brave dockworkers, inspired by Kael's stand, rushed into the yard with specialized chemical smothering salts.
Within 20 minutes of coordinated, strategic movement, the Great Harbor Fire was completely extinguished. The ships were safe. The winter food supply was intact. Kael and Gideon stumbled out into the cool morning air, their faces covered in black soot, their bodies exhausted and burned, but their hearts filled with absolute triumph. Silas walked up to Kael, looking at the young man's blistered hands, then back at the thousands of tons of grain that were already being safely unloaded onto the docks. "You're not just a kid with a checkbook, Kael," Silas said, his voice carrying a deep, unbending respect as he extended a massive hand. "You're a real logistics man. This harbor stands with you." But before Kael could take Silas's hand, the harsh, rhythmic wail of Illyrian security sirens tore through the salt air. 3 sleek, armored enforcement carriages screeched to a halt at the perimeter. A platoon of Vane's private security forces, accompanied by a cynical, high-ranking magistrate, marched onto the pier. They didn't look at the remnants of the alchemical firebombs or the witness statements of the dock workers. "Gideon of the Outer Desert," the magistrate announced, pointing a metallic finger at the soot-covered engineer. "We received an anonymous, sworn tip from an internal security contractor. You were seen manipulating the primary pressure valves immediately before the explosion. You are under arrest for industrial arson and the intentional endangerment of a sovereign municipal facility. This is a frame-up." Silas roared, stepping forward with his heavy iron cargo hook, his men tightening their circle around the enforcers. "He saved the damn port." "Let them take me, Silas," Gideon muttered quietly, placing a calm, heavy hand on the Union leader's shoulder. He looked at Kael, his tired eyes filled with absolute trust. "Keep the trucks rolling, kid. Don't let them freeze the clock." As the iron handcuffs clicked around Gideon's burned wrists, Kael's silver ring buzzed with a cold, mocking notification. It was a legal transmission from Vane's primary law firm. Because the facility was now designated an active criminal investigation site, an emergency federal injunction had been filed to halt all cargo distribution from the Misty Harbor for the next 24 hours. Kael stood on the wet stone pier, watching the enforcement carriage speed away with his closest friend, while the crimson countdown in his eyes relentlessly ticked away, 2400 hours 05 and 11 seconds. Vane had turned their heroic preservation into a legal cage, and Kael had exactly 1 day left to break the bars. The air inside the grand amphitheater of the Illyrian High Court did not circulate, it compressed. The chamber was a towering monument of ancient cedar and white slate, built during an era when justice was carved into stone rather than traded on digital ledgers. High above, the morning light filtered through a massive stained glass dome, casting fractured geometric shadows across the packed public galleries. Outside, the streets were choked. Word of Gideon's arrest and the impending permanent shutdown of the sovereign dock had rippled through the lower tiers like a seismic wave. Thousands of dock workers, local haulers, and common families stood shoulder to shoulder, their anxious murmurs vibrating through the thick wooden doors of the courtroom. Kael sat at the defense table, his charcoal overalls still stained with the soot of the harbor fire. His skin burned from the heat he had braved, but his eyes were locked on his silver ring. The crimson numbers in his field of vision were unyielding, 18 hours 12 minutes and 5 seconds. Less than 19 hours remained on the master clock. If Vane's emergency injunction survived this hearing, the harbor would remain frozen, the winter food supply would rot in the cargo bays, and the gauntlet would end in absolute failure. Across the marble aisle sat Vane. He looked immaculate, adjusting his silk cuffs with a slow, smug satisfaction. Beside him, Cynthia leaned back, her lips curled into a victorious smile. Vane held a heavy obsidian data slate containing a permanent federal seizure order signed by the House of Senate clans. He didn't look like a man participating in a legal debate, he looked like an executioner waiting for the blade to drop. At the elevated center bench sat Judge Sterling. He was a man of 70 winter years, possessing heavy, furrowed brows and a reputation for an unbending, old-school adherence to the founding laws of Illyria. He peered over his wire-rimmed spectacles, his gavel resting flat beneath his weathered palm. "Your Honor," Vane's lead attorney drawled, his voice echoing smoothly through the silent room. "The evidence is absolute. The sovereign dock is an active, hazardous crime scene. The defendant, Gideon, was caught red-handed manipulating the internal valves directly preceding a volatile chemical explosion. For the public safety of Illyria, and under the Emergency Terrorism Protocol, the Executive Trust requests an immediate, permanent injunction to dissolve the harbor's sovereign status and absorb its assets.
Iris stepped toward the podium.
She did not raise her voice. She did not rustle through stacks of character affidavits for Gideon, nor did she attempt to argue the mechanical specifics of the fire.
She knew that entering Vane's narrative was a trap. Instead, she laid a single sheet of blank, treated vellum on the clerk's desk.
The defense does not contest the physical mechanics of the fire, Your Honor, Iris announced calmly, her sharp eyes cutting across to Vane.
We contest the motive.
And to understand the motive, we must look not at the smoke in the sky, but at the phantom footprints left within the counting houses.
We call our primary witness, Sarah. A quiet ripple of curiosity passed through the gallery as Sarah stepped through the side entrance. She was 32, dressed in the simple, unadorned vestments of a royal treasury scribe.
A soft, pale silk blindfold was wrapped securely around her eyes. Sarah had been blind since birth, but in the financial circles of Illyria, she was considered a legend. She possessed a rare, highly specialized echo attunement, the ability to literally hear the resonance of transactions, tracking the hidden, invisible pathways of currency through complex magical matrices. Vane's posture stiffened by a fraction, his fingers tightening against his data slate. Sarah reached the witness stand, her hands holding a small, circular bronze plate etched with arithmetic runes. She placed her fingers onto the metal surface. Every coin leaves a sound, Sarah whispered, her soft voice carrying a strange, resonant clarity that commanded the entire room. A legal transaction rings like a silver bell. A hidden bribe hums with a flat, discordant friction.
Iris, activate the ledger hearth. Iris struck her advocate's staff against the floor.
A massive, circular projection matrix erupted from the center of the courtroom, illuminating the white slate walls with spinning columns of mathematical data. I am tracking the specific financial network of the primary safety contractor who verified the security failure at the port, Sarah stated, her fingers gently moving across the bronze plate as if playing an instrument. On the third night of the cycle, 48 hours before the fire broke out, a massive, unregistered packet of external wealth bypassed the Illyrian Central Exchange. It was an off-world transit, routed through a shell collective registered in a distant digital shadow haven called Panama. The columns of numbers spun wildly, glowing a sharp, neon blue, until they condensed into a single, devastating transit log. The amount, Sarah continued, her voice echoing through the breathless silence of the court, was exactly 80,000 credits. The ultimate beneficial owner of the originating account is a private, encrypted digital vault held under the personal name of Executor Vane.
The courtroom went completely dead silent.
The press gallery leaned forward over the wooden railings, their stylus pens hovering in midair.
Kael looked across the aisle.
The smug, untouchable mask on Vane's face had shattered, his skin turning a pale, sickly gray as the digital footprint was displayed for every camera to see.
This is an outrageous fabrication. Vane's attorney yelled, slamming his hands on the table.
This court has no jurisdiction over off-world digital havens. An unverified external log cannot tie a royal executor to a localized safety issue. It ties the money directly to the safety contractor's private ledger, Iris interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests like a scalpel as she handed a secondary parchment to the court bailiff.
This is the signed, sealed confession of the head security contractor, obtained an hour ago by the High Court investigators.
He details the exact audio instructions he received from Vane's personal communication frequency, ordering him to disable the harbor perimeter lanterns in exchange for that exact sum.
The irony was a physical weight in the room.
80,000 credits, the precise amount that had started Kael's journey, the price of Lyra's breath that Vane had used as a hostage, had now become the exact digital phantom that unraveled Vane's entire conspiracy. Judge Sterling leaned forward, his ancient eyes burning with an old-school, terrifying fury.
He didn't look at the lawyers.
He looked directly down at Vane, who was now sweating beneath his immaculate charcoal tunic. Mr. Executor, Judge Sterling said, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register that sounded like a shifting mountain. This court was founded before your corporate houses even laid their first brick. We have tolerated your administrative holds, your compliance reviews, and your financial maneuvering because they fell within the technical margins of the modern codex. But this... Sterling slammed his fist onto the wooden desk, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot.
This is an act of calculated industrial sabotage against a sovereign enclave of the crown.
Your Honor, the federal clan councils, Vane attempted to speak, his voice desperate. The federal clans do not govern this bench. Judge Sterling roared, raising his heavy wooden gavel. The emergency injunction to freeze the Misty Harbor is hereby denied and permanently dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate, unconditional release of Gideon from the Central Precinct, with a full restoration of his civil titles. The judge brought the gavel down with a resounding, thunderous crack. The public gallery erupted into an absolute frenzy of triumph. The dock workers screamed, throwing their hats into the air, while the local haulers pounded their heavy fists against the wooden benches. The sound of their victory bled through the windows, and outside on the plaza, a massive, roaring cheer rose from the thousands of citizens who realized that their food, their water, and their defenders had just been set free. Kael turned to Iris, a deep, overwhelming wave of emotion lifting the crushing weight from his chest. He looked at his silver ring. The clock was still ticking at 17 hours 35 minutes and 12 seconds, but for the first time in 5 days, he wasn't running alone. They had broken the legal cage. Vane stood up slowly, his face a mask of cold, venomous hatred as the court enforcers moved to secure his financial slates for corporate audit. He leaned across the wooden divider, his eyes boring into Kael with an intensity that felt like dry ice. "You think you've won, boy?" Vane hissed, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that was swallowed by the cheering crowd. "You've cleared the court, but you haven't seen what happens when the real system turns on you. You still have hundreds of millions to clear, and I have one final switch left to flip." An hour later, the heavy iron gates of the high precinct swung open. Gideon walked out into the crisp salt air, his wrists bruised but his head held higher than Kael had ever seen it. Silas met him with a roaring laugh, clapping his massive hand onto the engineer's shoulder, while the dock workers cleared a path of honor for them. The harbor was theirs again. The logistics network was open. But as Kael looked up at the winter clouds thickening over the city, the sudden, shrill screech of a transit siren tore through the air. 3 massive, black, unmarked utility transport carriages bearing the high federal seal of the Central Treasury Division pulled onto the pier, their armored hulls blocking the exit. A man in a dark federal windbreaker stepped out, holding a thick, gold-embossed administrative warrant. The final, absolute blockade had arrived, and it didn't care about local judges. The gold-embossed administrative warrant held by the federal agents was a terrifying testament to Vane's desperation. But before the agents could deploy their compliance fields across the pier, the silver ring on Kael's finger vibrated violently. The digital countdown in his vision flickered in a sickening pulse of crimson light, 12 hours 4 minutes and 59 seconds. Exactly 12 hours remained. Then, without a sound, the brilliant, pulsating white energy lines woven into the concrete harbor docks, the very veins of the city's modern managrid, went completely dead. One by one, the massive automated Magus cranes shuddered, their glowing containment runes evaporating into thin air. The sleek cargo gliders dropped a few inches to the ground with a heavy, hollow thud. The blinding harbor spotlights flickered out, plunging the entire sovereign dock into a profound, freezing winter darkness. Driven to madness by his defeat in the High Court, Vane had utilized his final, absolute executive override as the director of the Energy Guild. He hadn't just frozen an account, he had cut the throat of the city's power grid. Without the mana grid, the automated logistics network was a paralyzed iron corpse. Tens of thousands of tons of life-saving winter grain and medical supplies sat trapped inside the dark, unyielding cargo hulls. In 12 hours, the master clock would hit zero, the food would freeze and rot in the damp ocean air, and the estate would revert to the trust. Standing at the perimeter gate, watching the sudden, terrifying darkness swallow the harbor, was Mayor Henderson. Henderson was 50, a career politician with graying hair at his temples and an immaculate, sharp woolen coat that signaled his high office. He was a deeply pragmatic man, someone who had spent 2 decades balancing on the razor-thin edge between the corrupt Senate clans and the desperate lower tiers. He wasn't evil, but he wasn't a saint, he moved wherever the political winds blew strongest. Right now, he held a federal enforcement seal in his trembling hand, sent by Vane to legally seal the gates under the guise of an uncontrolled energy crisis. The harbor is dead, Kael, Mayor Henderson said, his voice carrying a heavy, defensive weight as Silas and his dock workers clustered near the iron barrier. Without the mana grid, this port is an operational hazard. Under Section 9 of the Central Code, I am legally required to endorse this federal seal and close the gates.
Go home, kid. You can't fight a total blackout. Kael didn't look at the politician. He looked up at the towering, dark silhouette of the old harbor lighthouse, a stone monument built in 1887, long before the modern city even conceived of a digital mana grid. Gideon. Silas. Keep those gates held for 15 minutes. Kael shouted, his voice cutting through the freezing wind. Don't let them click that seal. Turning on his heel, Kael ran toward the lighthouse, his boots pounding against the slick, icy stone stairs of the spiral tower. His lungs burned in the frozen night air, but his mind was calculating at a feverish, mechanical pace. He burst into the long-abandoned lantern room at the apex. The air was thick with decades of dust and sea salt. Resting on a heavy iron table was an archaic relic of the founding era, a massive, copper-shielded vacuum tube radio transmitter. It was completely mechanical, designed to run on a primitive, independent thermal battery that Vane's digital blackout couldn't touch. Gideon had secretly restored the vacuum tubes the night before. Kael wiped the thick dust off the heavy bronze microphone dial. He flipped the manual knife switch. With a deep, warming, defiant orange glow, the massive glass tubes hummed to life, sending a raw, unfiltered analog frequency tearing through the Illyrian Valley. It didn't rely on the high-tier communication mirrors, it hijacked every small, low-frequency kitchen radio, auto shop receiver, and local diner booth speaker in the outer tiers. Kael grabbed the microphone. His voice didn't shake. It was warm, intimate, yet laced with a dramatic urgency that demanded attention. Queen of Illyria, Kael's voice echoed into the cold kitchens and crowded tenements of the slums. My name is Kael. Right now, as I speak to you, the food meant to feed your families through the coming winter freeze is sitting inside the cargo bays of the misty harbor. Vane has cut the power to the grid. He has plunged the port into darkness because he wants you to believe we are powerless. He wants to watch the clock run out so he can reclaim the fortune that belongs to you. Kael leaned closer to the microphone, his words carried on the analog waves like an unbreakable promise. We have exactly 12 hours left to spend the inheritance on your children, or the corporate trust takes it all back. I am not asking for a miracle. I am asking for your hands. Come to the docks. Bring your lanterns. Bring your strength. Help us take back our tomorrow. For a long, agonizing minute, the harbor remained completely silent, save for the howling winter wind and the nervous shifting of Mayor Henderson's security guards. Henderson raised the federal stamp, preparing to press it into the iron gate's locking mechanism. Time's up, kid, the mayor muttered, looking at the dark, silent horizon. Then, a single speck of light appeared at the edge of the Sector 4 ridge. Then another. And another. Within 20 minutes, a breathtaking, cinematic tide of warmth began to wind down the steep harbor road. It was a human wall of fire, tens of thousands of citizens marching shoulder to shoulder through the freezing night. Dock workers, common teachers, factory laborers, and elderly grandmothers, all carrying old kerosene lamps, scrapwood torches, and industrial battery lanterns. The collective light of 20,000 ordinary people cut through the absolute darkness, turning the black harbor into a brilliant, golden arena of hope. Mayor Henderson froze, his hand hovering over the gate. The sheer scale of the crowd was unprecedented. These weren't just rioters, they were his voters, his citizens, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of their torches, chanting Kael's name in a unified, thunderous rhythm that shook the very foundations of the pier. Iris stepped forward from the crowd, thrusting the ancient 1887 Sovereign Charter directly into Henderson's trembling hands. Sign that federal lock order now, Mayor, Iris said, her voice ringing with absolute legal authority, and you violate the founding sovereign Hien Chuang of your own city. Look at them. If you seal these gates tonight, tomorrow you won't have an office left to govern. Henderson looked at the parchment, then looked out at the sea of 20,000 determined faces. The pragmatic politician within him made his final choice. He took the federal lock order, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it into the freezing harbor water. Open the gates. Henderson bellowed to his guards. The port remains operational.
The crowd erupted into a triumphant cheer that echoed across the ocean. But the victory was only structural, they still had no electricity. The massive cargo containers, weighing 40 tons each, were still trapped in the dark holds.
We don't need their digital grid.
Kael shouted, running down from the lighthouse and stepping onto a wooden crate in the center of the yard. He unrolled a massive sheet of structural vellum, drawing a series of complex geometric lines with a thick piece of charcoal.
Silas, organize the men into 10-man teams. We are bypassing the automated cranes entirely. We are going to use the port's old, forgotten manual infrastructure.
Kael's logistics mind had mapped out a complete system of logistics by human strength. He designed a massive, interconnected web of mechanical pulleys, rope counterweights, and physical gravity chutes, utilizing the raw weight of the crowd to lift the smaller cargo crates. Meanwhile, deep within the southern sector of the harbor, a long-forgotten brick structure began to groan. This was the decommissioned 1887 steam house, an archaic power plant that had sat cold and silent for 40 years.
Gideon was inside, his clothes torn, throwing heavy blocks of black coal into the cavernous, rusted iron furnace.
His hands were blistered, his muscles screaming with exhaustion, but his face was set in stone.
"Give me fire!" Gideon roared, shoveling another massive heap into the belly of the beast.
A spark caught, then a warm, deep orange glow bloomed in the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows across the old brick walls. The ancient boilers began to hiss and scream as water turned to high-pressure steam. The primitive, mechanical pressure needles shuddered, slowly climbing out of the dead zone for the first time in a generation. With a deafening, thunderous mechanical screech that sounded like an awakening dragon, the primary overhead shafts of the harbor's old mechanical steam cranes began to rotate. The thick, woven steel cables groaned under the immense tension, but they held. The steam cranes reached down into the ships, their heavy iron arms moving not by digital code, but by the raw, unstoppable force of pressure and fire. Under the brilliant, golden flicker of 20,000 torches, the greatest logistics operation in Illyria's history unfolded.
Thousands of hands worked in a flawless, rhythmic machine.
Containers were hooked, swung to the docks, and opened manually. Dock workers and citizens formed massive human chains, passing crates of winter grain, medical essence, and thermal blankets from the ships directly into the waiting iron wagons. Mohoy mixed with the freezing winter condensation.
Blood dripped from calloused hands, but no one quit.
Kael stood at the center of the docks, his silver ring flashing continuously as the automated ledger verified each physical cargo manifest as a permanent, legally completed humanitarian donation. The numbers on his ring were spinning down at a staggering rate: 300 million.
200 million. 100 million.
The final crate of life-saving provisions touched the concrete dock just as the first pale blue light of dawn began to break through the winter smog. Kael held the final, physical manifest, signed in ink by Silas and verified by Mayor Henderson. He looked down at his ring. The master clock showed exactly 6 hours. 6 hours remained. The cargo was cleared, the city was saved from the winter freeze, and the entire 1 billion credits had been successfully committed to the public infrastructure. But as the crowd cheered beneath the warm glow of their dying torches, Kael collapsed onto his knees, his breath catching in his chest. He held the signed papers tight against his heart, knowing that the final, most dangerous sprint was about to begin. They had raised the steam from the grave, but Vane was still waiting in the high courts with the paperwork of reversion, and the digital ledger had not yet cleared the escrow hold. The engine of the independent steam transport was still burning hot, radiating a fierce, mechanical warmth into the crisp, upper-tier air as Kael, Iris, and Silas burst through the heavy oak doors of the high executive suite. They did not knock. Silas threw the reinforced barriers open so hard the brass handles dented the pristine white plaster walls. Every high-resolution lens in the room, positioned by the media wagons to capture the historic climax of the Illyria gauntlet, pivoted instantly. The aristocratic observers in the gallery had gathered to witness the final, crushing failure of a broken slum dweller. Instead, they were faced with 3 individuals covered in sweat, black coal ash, and an absolute, unshakable certainty. Vane didn't even stand up from his high-backed velvet chair. He sat behind his massive obsidian desk, a glass of expensive amber nectar resting near his fingertips. Behind him, a giant holographic projection mirrored the digital ledger of the Illyria Central Exchange. It displayed the remaining $344 million of the Gauntlet Fund locked behind a flashing, yellow pending escrow hold. Cynthia stood by the glass window, her emerald tunic slightly rumpled from her frantic night of failed blockades, but her lips were twisted into a sharp, desperate grin. She pointed a manicured finger at the glowing digital clock on the wall. 10 seconds. 9 seconds. "You are too late, insect," Cynthia laughed, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent, cloud-piercing chamber. "The digital clearinghouse is sealed for the weekend. The banking regulations require a 24-hour processing window for macro-scale transfers. You can have all the manual manifests you want, but the ledger hasn't cleared. In less than 5 seconds, the clock hits zero, the contract defaults, and every single coin returns to the private control of the family trust." Kael didn't look at the digital clock. His face, weathered by 48 hours of non-stop structural warfare and lined with mild soot burns, remained perfectly calm. He walked directly to the obsidian desk, his worn leather boots leaving heavy, gray footprints on the polished white marble floor. With a single, decisive motion, he slammed a massive stack of heavy, hand-inked parchment documents directly onto Vane's glass display. The papers bore the physical, raw, crimson wax indentation of the 1887 Sovereign Harbor Charter, freshly co-signed by Silas and verified under the authority of Mayor Henderson. 1 second. Midnight. A harsh, systemic chime resonated through the silver band on Kael's finger. The crimson countdown vanished entirely, replaced by a brilliant, blinding green seal that mirrored itself onto the master holographic wall. "What is this?" Vane whispered, his smooth voice cracking for the first time in 7 days as his fingers trembled against his glass. He tapped the data slate frantically, but the technical system refused to register a default. "The banking ledger shows pending. The digital funds are still held in escrow." "The digital funds are a promise, Vane, but the sovereign charter is an absolute physical reality," Iris stated, stepping forward as she adjusted her public defender's robes, her voice carrying the sharp precision of a surgical blade. Under Article 4 of the 1887 Enclave Decree, which Judge Sterling verified into the High Court record yesterday morning, any cargo that physically touches the soil of the sovereign dock is legally recognized as an instantaneous, irreversible humanitarian distribution. The value is liquidated the exact second it hits the concrete. The modern federal banking delays have zero jurisdiction inside those gates. The money didn't clear through your digital networks, it cleared through the sweat of 20,000 citizens. The columns of numbers on the wall suddenly recalculated, the pending yellow blocks dissolving into solid, brilliant emerald lines. The final balance read exactly zero. Kael leaned over the desk, placing his calloused, grease-stained hands directly onto the dark stone, looking straight into the wide, terrified eyes of the executor. "The gauntlet is complete, Vane," Kael said, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register that carried the collective weight of the lower tiers. "And as the sole, rightful heir to the Illyria Wealth Trust, I am delivering the first executive order of my new life. Vane, your contract is severed. You are terminated as the executor of Alden's estate, effective immediately. Get out from behind my desk." Cynthia gasped, lunging forward, her aristocratic composure completely disintegrating. "This is an ancient loophole. An absolute joke. You cannot strip our family name based on a piece of moldy paper from the last century." "We aren't finished, Lady Cynthia," Iris interrupted, hoisting a secondary, massive leather-bound accounting ledger onto the central podium. "While you were deploying private mercenaries to burn down our biofuel reserves and freezing our medical supply lines, our forensic scribe, Sarah, was auditing the historical charity accounts from the previous 3 fiscal cycles. We have just submitted a secondary filing to the High Magistrate." The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a synchronized, heavy metallic thud. 4 high-tier officers dressed in the deep blue longcoats of the federal agents of Illyria stepped across the threshold, their polished brass badges catching the bright morning light. They didn't look at Kael, and they didn't look at the press. They marched straight toward the management table. "Executor Vane, Lady Cynthia," the lead agent announced, drawing a golden-bossed federal arrest warrant from his belt. "Under the authority of the High Court Treasury, you are being placed under immediate asset restraint." The audit has verified that over the past 24 months, you have systematically embezzled 64 million gold credits from Alden's regional orphanage and eldercare funds, routing them into private offshore accounts to finance your commercial expansion. The metallic, cold click of heavy iron handcuffs echoed with absolute clarity over the sudden, stunned murmurs of the gallery. Vane's hands froze on his briefcase, his face turning the color of wet paper as the agents firmly gripped his silk sleeves, pulling him away from the executive chair. Cynthia began to weep, her emerald coat sliding off her shoulders onto the marble floor as she was escorted toward the service exit. As the agents dragged Vane past Kael, the former executor suddenly stopped. His elegant charcoal tunic was rumpled, his hair messy, but his eyes held a desperate, wide, and terrifying intensity. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous, distorted whisper that cut through the sounds of the cheering reporters. "You think you've won, boy?" Vane hissed, a wild, jagged smile breaking through his pale features. "You think old Alden was a saint who rewarded a slum kid out of the goodness of his heart? You poor, blind fool. The silver ring, the 1 billion credits, the entire humanitarian gauntlet, it wasn't a charity test. It was a filter. It was a cover to identify someone who could calculate the underbelly of the infrastructure. Look at the ledger's hidden files, Kael. Look at what he actually built." The agents shoved Vane forward, slamming the heavy oak doors shut behind them, leaving the grand chamber to erupt into a massive, chaotic storm of celebratory flashes and shouting journalists. Kael didn't participate in the media frenzy. He didn't answer the flashing questions of the reporters. He turned directly to the central podium, picking up the official charter of the Wealth Trust. "Today, this 20 billion credits does not belong to me," Kael's voice resonated through the house audio arrays, carrying out onto the crowded plaza below where thousands were still waiting. "And it never will. I am permanently transferring the entirety of the Illyria Wealth Trust into an independent, public-governed community foundation. It will be managed not by corporate boards or noble families, but by a council of the dock workers, the nurses, the local farmers, and the tier leaders who actually kept this city alive when the lights went out." He signed the document with a simple wooden pen, handing it directly to Iris and Silas. The wealth of the highest tier had been permanently redistributed into the hands of the people who built the world. With the trust secured, there was only one logistics route left to clear. Kael returned to trade dat through the primary cross-world transport corridor. He didn't go to the sterile VIP ward of the Eldritch Medical Center. He walked down the crumbling, familiar streets of Sector 4, stepping into the quiet, modest interior of the public charity clinic. The air smelled of simple antiseptic and old wood, but it was warm. He walked into Ward 3. Lyra looked up from her simple metal bed. The old, manual respiratory pump had been completely replaced by a brand new, top-tier recovery crystal core, provided by the very manufacturing lease Kael had forced into law 2 days prior. Her skin was no longer pale, her breathing was deep, silent, and completely free of the gravelly rattle that had haunted her for years. The medical ledger at the foot of her bed displayed a single, beautiful word stamped in bright green ink. She didn't ask about the billions, and she didn't care about the high courts. She simply threw her arms around Kael's neck, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated relief as he held her tight, the crushing weight of their survival finally evaporating into the quiet afternoon air. They were free. Later that evening, Kael returned to Alden's ancestral estate on the highest ridge of Illyria to collect his remaining personal items. The massive, Gothic corporate mansion was empty and silent, filled with the long shadows of a man who had spent his life testing the limits of human greed. As Kael walked through the grand library, checking the logistics maps one last time, he noticed Gideon and Iris packing the old historical archives into wooden storage crates. Kael walked toward the heavy oak cabinet at the back of the study, the one Alden had used during his final days. As his fingers brushed against a small, decorative copper molding near the base, a soft, mechanical click resonated through the wood. A hidden compartment slid back, revealing an ancient, brass-rimmed keyhole embedded deep within the dark grain. Kael reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusted iron key, the very key that had unlocked the water plant safe and the Sovereign Charter. He fitted it into the lock. With a heavy, metallic groan of shifting counterweights, the entire center wall section swung open, revealing a hidden, reinforced concrete vault. Kael stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat as his lantern illuminated the interior. The room wasn't filled with magical crystals or ancient scrolls. It was a pristine, dust-free laboratory filled with rows of functional, humming electronic server racks, green-screen computer terminals, and twin-spool magnetic tape drives, technology from trade dating explicitly from the late 1980s. Resting on a single steel pedestal at the center of the laboratory sat a small, leather-bound handwritten logbook and a heavy, industrial-grade, solid red unlisted satellite phone. It had no magical runes, no digital interface, just a plastic antenna pointing straight up through a narrow copper conduit in the ceiling. Kael approached the pedestal, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up the leather logbook. He flipped the cover open. Written in Alden's precise, distinct handwriting was a single, chilling sentence: "The Illyria gauntlet is complete. Participant number 12 has successfully restructured the regional infrastructure. Initiating Phase 2. Suddenly, the silent vault was shattered by a sharp, high-pitched, electronic ring. The red satellite phone began to vibrate violently against the steel pedestal, its small, liquid crystal display flashing a single line of unlisted text in the dark: "Crossworld comms active." Kael's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slowly reached out, his blistered fingers lifting the heavy plastic receiver to his ear. He didn't speak. He just listened to the steady, rhythmic static humming through the deep space frequency. From the other end of the line, 10 million light-years away, a cold, heavily distorted, synthesized voice spoke with absolute, terrifying clarity. "Congratulations, participant Kael. You have survived the first filter. Your logistics metrics have been uploaded to the central matrix. Prepare yourself. Phase 2 of the gauntlet begins in 48 hours. The line went completely dead, leaving Kael standing alone in the hidden room, the red phone still humming in his hand as a brand new, unfished countdown began to blink in the dark.